Daniel Barton's poetry delves deeply into the veins of eco-poetics while experimenting with form and line to comment on the breakdown of the environment around us and the parts of life within that environment so ingrained in each of us: love, death, beauty. These are large themes to work with, but Daniel does this with an enviable use of palpable imagery, staggering sonic moments, and steady-handed play with craft. In his Body Farm series, there is a decomposition on a couple of levels. From the bodies liquefying and becoming one with the earth in which they seep, the deconstructing of the sonnet form in ways that feel as natural as the character of nature that threads through his work. In Letter from Atlantis, one finds strains of imagery throughout its sections that truly transfixes and carries us on a journey about love and its staggering role in our lives, showing us how it has the potential to both destroy and invigorate us. The affecting use of enjambment Daniel uses in his work carries the reader into a complexity that at once disorients and guides us through his poems. In Altar with Dragonfly and Wasp, enjambment creates a tension while acting as a guiding force. He writes, "The dragonfly still echoes flight, ecstasy in the flicker of loss, uncoupled wings in our silence consumed by the wasp's hum and spark." The sonic quality throughout the poem and others puts a reader within the nature he summons and so succinctly celebrates. Loss is here, a loss that is seemingly bottomless, threatening to swallow us just as it promises to lead us into a communal affair with nature, love, and unwavering passion. This passion is felt throughout Daniel's work and gifts the reader with a guided journey into passion and all that comes with that passion. Loss is life in his poems, and it is a needed reminder in times where so much decomposes underfoot, within us, and all around us. But there is an upside here, not necessarily a cheery celebration, but a beautiful one that teaches and leads us to a whole new understanding of all that is within and outside of ourselves and the nature running alongside and inside of us. In his Body Farm series, A Crown of Deconstructed Sonnets, decomposition is quite literally there in his breaking down of form and line, and in its astute and emotive imagery that lays out our mortality, our inevitable loss of self and death, and our body's last moment with the earth that will continue to usher in a renewed nature as we feed the earth in becoming one with it. In frame number 8 of this series, the 3 opening stanzas directs us into loss as it promises an immortality. Growing only as echo, one body simmers char black against green, as another, only bones, boils over with vines, ghosts of veins, leaves, paled by wind. These can be read. There's one with shattered ribs, unraveled by vultures, and gray-blue dawn. There is a familiarity in what has made us up in life, bones, veins, ribs, and what ushers us into the nature we commune with in death, vines, leaves, vultures, and that final dawn. Although Daniel has an unprecedented eloquence in such a subject, in the biological and ecological dance we embark upon in death and in a renewed, even evolved life, I am reminded of Mary Roach's book, Stiff. I am certain she would also be envious of his ability to have a command of that biology and ecology with a constant breezy sway of imagery that possesses a beauty such a subject would not normally warrant. Daniel's dexterous divination of language and in form in these poems and all others stays with me as a reader. His poems are ghostly companions for me long after I finish reading them, sauntering into my mind and body, my mortality, and promise of an immortality, knowing there is a final and lasting moment with nature and the cosmos that is so much a part of it. Daniel's poems have appeared in several journals, including Grist, Permafrost, and The Bitter Oleander. He received his Bachelor's of Arts in English from Flagler College and his Master of Fine Arts in Poetry from Texas State University. And of course, we're all honored to have him a part of the program for writers here at the University of Illinois at Chicago. It is my pleasure to introduce my dear friend and masterful colleague and PhD candidate, David Barton, or Daniel Barton. Oh, gosh, sorry. It was going so well. Sorry, Dan.
That's okay. I'll go with by David too. Thank you so much. All right, so following up on that wonderful introduction, I figured I'd start today with a poem of departure because everything seems backwards these days anyway, so might as well start with a goodbye. And in this poem, I mentioned fulgurite, which I don't know if people have heard of, but it's when like lightning strikes sand on the beach, it turns into these like really cool glass crystal structures that are fascinating and weirdly beautiful. So this is Abad with fulgurite and vines. Is it because railroad vines consume the dunes and webs of bloom, you thought proximity was enough, we could open into each other and not suffocate, as wax myrtle and palmetto grow roots in sand and breathe despite absence. We've disassembled too often to survive. The silence you beat fist upon, fist against, here is a tide pool, rippled and stilled, silver shadows of fish circling to escape. And if I found my boundaries clawed by waves, clenched fists relenting, winter brittle Spartina, tangles of fishing line and plastic bags like jellyfish, as half drowned and shapeless thing, I've been a ghost in the light, stinging at the touch. While at night storms burn the world blue metallic, cauterizing sand to glass. In the morning, we find electric, some new bruise crystallized, a gift that shatters, like the vines when vermilion petals give way to green. All right, so this next is Letters from Atlantis, and the whole origin of this series started from like reading Mark Doty's poem Fog Argument, and he is talking about the marsh, which is a landscape I've always been really fascinated with. As just a really complex ecosystem and also just an amazingly beautiful place. But in the poem, he compares the marsh to a page on which anything might be written, which made me start thinking about kind of the violence that metaphors can do to landscape and like place, that it kind of just erases everything else about it and like transformed this marsh, which is such a complex living ecosystem, into like an empty page. So this started out as kind of a cheeky pushback against Doty, but as I progressed, something else came out of it. So I just kept going with more poems, and I originally started these as like a group of individual poems under the same title. However, this is going to be the first time I'm going to try reading them as a unified sequence. So we'll see how that goes. This is Letters from Atlantis. 1. What pulls us to still metallic pushes back. You found it endless, the rippling cord grass buried in sun-splashed tide. Standing with muddied feet before the same field of jade, I wanted to be more than longing that makes the inlet gray into evening, the page empty of language. You know what I'd write there, you wrote it too. The desire to be taken in, held, irresistibly lost and found. You wanted escape and into loss, to see water leave the marsh a pane of glass and light given back. I wait to be emptied, to feel the world ebb and redefine. When the water's gone and grass bends pale in the wind, I turn to shore and know. Oysters blackened by mud, mouths like knives, I flood to the quick. 2. Here, even your reflection is unreadable. Water reveals itself only through shadows, oak leaves blown against a burning sky, petrified trees stranded in the margins between sand and tide. Swimming from shore, you'd rend the surface to find only the fractured bodies of oysters and corroding hooks fishermen cast and cut. The light water gives is not its own. The suggestion of algae flecked silhouettes, no more than a shuddering of wind. If it was easy to unburden ourselves, I could step past the still wet line of mud and re-emerge glistening, but the water hoards what we abandon. I break at the touch. You'll find me where overfall shatters what you wanted to be endless. Etchings of cordgrass and sun embraced by collapsing waves, like me, fractured as so many splinters of glass, transparent enough to cut. 3. If, as you claim, sky is oceanic, bound only by pencil line of trees rippling the far shore, what is the blue tane burning the charblack tips of cordgrass? Are these sudden swell of a fish pushing past the surface and, for a second, refusing the tension of its known world, its melting back? You claim it's natural to desire embrace, the bite of salt water slipping over skin, one leg at a time, until all that remains is sunburnt sky broken by waves. But here, what is lost from sight cuts, razor thin muscles open to the tide, shattered crab traps calcified by years of barnacle and rot. It's okay to look for me under clouds of silt and wade still further towards sun. Just know, here I am urchin beneath brine and needle at the touch. 4. Don't think of me as lost. Even corroded cans discarded by weakened fishermen have form, though brittled by months of salt. The marsh at high tide is still a field of tarnished bronze, though moved by the current. You'll see, once water recedes, fiddler crabs return to litter mud-caked roots and ripple the pale line between sand and rot of dead Spartina, centuries of crushed shell. There are days I've wanted to be found, what is broken and buried by years of mud and tide, to be lifted clean, glistening, like the fiddler crabs, their sapphire shells, shining free from tangled line of marsh wrack and discarded bits of cloth, turned constellation despite the threat of circling gulls and knowing their hunger, the shock of wings and descent. Still, I only recede further from shore. I cannot empty myself any more than you could by me. Don't be upset if I'm always just out of reach. It is revelation enough that as fiddler crabs retreat with the approach of tide, muscles at the roots of cordgrass unclench razor-sharp mouths that they can finally breathe. So change of scenery to Texas. In Texas, there are these really large fire red wasps that are just big, mean assholes, kind of scary. But apparently they're carnivorous, or at least will scavenge the bodies of other insects, which I didn't find out until my friend and I went on a picnic and we had to witness that for ourselves. So if you needed another reason to be afraid of wasps, you're welcome. This is altar with dragonfly and wasp. This is not the intimacy we wanted. Thorax flowered open, wings wilting across sunburnt sage. The pyre of a body offered to fire red wasps descending in turns, peeling more of it to collapse. Segmented abdomen lifted, a spray of pollen in the wind. Not what we looked for, emptying a bottle of Tempranillo between ourselves in that drought-scorched park. But what have we found together that wasn't an unmaking? The sharp edges between bodies tangle and cut. The dragonfly still echoes flight, ecstasy in the flicker of loss, uncoupled wings and our silence, consumed by the wasp's hum and spark. Have we not also disassembled each other in the waning heat of evening, peeled back another part of ourselves and called it opening? Like the dragonfly, caved by another's hunger, we know the shatter of wasp's final right, the last bit of shell lifted free from glistening altar, and as the now unburdened leaves are left trembling, what remains is embers embraced by an updraft, wasp wings simmering and flown. All right, so time to talk about some dead bodies. So this is my body farm sonnet sequence that Carrie mentioned. And the origins of this, when I lived in Texas, I lived for a couple years out on this small ranch property out in the hill country next door to the university's big ranch that they operate for agricultural students. And on this property, they Also have a forensic anthropology research center where they lay out dead bodies and to study how they decompose. So for like 2 years, I kind of lived in the immediate vicinity of this area, which kind of made me like oddly like perversely fascinated with this whole concept. So I did a lot of research on it. And one of the things that what struck me in my research was this photograph from the body farm of this deer stepping through the like skeletal remains of this body, and he had what looked like a rib bone hanging out of his mouth, which was disturbing for a number of reasons. One, it seemed like Bambi had finally snapped and was taking no prisoners, but also just like the transgression of like what like body boundaries that we have, this like human remains being reclaimed by nature in this really startling way. So I started writing these sonnets in kind of response, and I've been calling them decomposed sonnets, partly for the pun of it, but also because I've been playing around with form and seeing how stripped down I can make these poems and them still be considered sonnets. And it's a crown, so it's 14 sonnets, each one starting with the last line of the previous one. And I'm just going to read like a few from here and there, different parts of the sequence. So beginning with frame number 2. This is how the world consumes us. Eyes become seedlings spilled into new leaves and bitter weed. What remains is a cage of bones, arms outstretched from green stone, and ribs like stamina and pistol, bleached white, exploding in bloom. A tangle of vines like the heart. It's not hard to see, light unmakes each sinew. What is once familiar no longer speaks. A mouth set to scream despite the silence. Still, fractured and open, we outgrow our boundaries. Frame number 3. Fractured and open, we outgrow our boundaries, tendons still as vines caught in the apex of bloom. We spin ourselves to webs of open wounds, fold and wilting, the body's a spray of petals in supernova, burning red, clover, putrefied, brittle as ash. Our desires leave us, simmering until we've overfilled our seams. We're left seared by the expression, cultivating ourselves as gardens we cannot claim. Frame number 6. Wilting, we reveal ourselves in tangled geographies, all spine and clavicle, what we quietly stomach by living in our bodies, veins of drought, burnt earth, parched by a sun unthread through oak branch. What remains of skin brittles in desert wind, concealing the swell of maggots beneath. How we arch ourselves toward the world, pulled by sinew and fracture open. What's left is locked in sunken breasts, the putrefied weight of shatter. Frame number 7. The putrefied weight of shatter threads mold-burnt cheekbone to brittle grass. The last breath of clover and bluebonnets staining the field indigo as sage petrified by winter unsettles at the suggestion of rain. Are we doomed to extinguish what threatens proximity, pale gold of bitterweed, seared past form, our expressions expanding us to collapse? We gasp and grow only as echo. Frame 8. Growing only as echo, one body simmers charblack against green, as another, only bones, boils over with vines, ghosts of veins, leaves, paled by wind. These can be read. There's one with shattered ribs, unraveled by vultures, and gray-blue dawn. Only the spine remains legible, dull vertebrae, half consumed by rain, hard earth, the only signification we have left. To let the world press, blood-stained talon to chest, a shudder of feathers, until we scatter as so many threads. And do one more, and this is also the most recent poem I've written, so testing it out on you guys. Frame number 10. Body is tremble in silence, cold snap to motion and the emptiness after, warmed by morning, vibration of circling flies, pale sun, latticed by leaves, Body is what we draw into ourselves, still damp blades of sweetgrass. The flicker after a single bead of last night's rain builds and drops, builds and shatters into symphony, impact and muffled sear of water on already scorched stone. Though what we dream is body displacing world is only held breath, what leaves and their fading brilliance, a final release. Right, so that's Body Farm. And this next poem is based on real events. I was solo hiking on Cumberland Island, which is on the southern coast of Georgia. It's really beautiful natural park island. And I had this encounter with a boar, and I wanted to write about it, but then I've been afraid to because then I'd fall into the wonderful tradition of poets writing about encounters with animals. And like, you know, the poems where it's like, look how profound of a moment I had with this divine other. And so I struggled for a while, like how to approach this without falling into those traps. And I decided ultimately just had to face that tradition head on. So this is my encounter poem, but also anti-encounter poem. And I also directly quote William Stafford, who might be one of the biggest culprits of those kind of poems in this. This is after the encounter. If this was about the boar I startled walking alone through a break of palmetto, I'd tell you about the mud-soaked fur and onyx-caved eyes, rigid haunches bristling to a stop close enough for me to reach the peak of his shoulders. I'd tell you how we stood inside the reek of earth and shit as I tried to be more than I was, and how I thought hard for us all instead of a lover's knife point gaze, my silence, how I missed the long drives she swore would bring us closer, searching for a clear night shattered by stars, even after another breakdown. But this isn't about her, our connection. It isn't even about the boar or how no one would have heard him sheath his tusk in my side. It's about the man I saw, hit by a bus, skull catching late afternoon sun from a nest of blood red leaves, and how, as with the boar, I could only stand by as he passed without words. I thought being found was a prerequisite of the lost, and getting close could be close enough. What I wanted to be haunted, palmettos shuddering behind the fading boar, turned out to be only salt air, heavy with ghosts of waves, the disassembling shore. All right, so I have one more poem to read, and then I'll turn it over to David. And this poem, I'm ending with a poem about family, which I haven't done too much. And so my grandmother grew up on a farm in Kansas, like during the Dust Bowl, and I grew up listening to stories about how her father, my great grandfather, worked in steam shovels at coal mines in Kansas and also for the railroad. So kind of just me working through those stories and like connection. And this was inspired by one time like cleaning out the garden in my parents' backyard and encountering the old tools from my grandmother's Kansas farm, which made me start remembering all of these stories she told. Clearing the garden. We unburden ourselves in rust, old spades and pitchforks from grandmother's Dust Bowl farm left to the rain. She spoke of turning unyielding fields each year more fondly than the home her husband built, how her father, digging coal and steam shovels by day, tried to mend the earth each morning, the worn wood of each tool a ledger of parched loam. We peel half-rotten board from board, an old shed left unfinished, and scattered chipmunks, the hordes of nuts and the cavities between rusting sides and latticed slants of light. I looked through, wondering at a world I learned to see, diffracted. We keep only what is broken, flower pots cracked by vines, a wheelbarrow collapsing, still balanced on a loose roll brimming with ivy. What she wanted for us no more tangible than rows of distant corn, leaves turned pale by dust. Thank you. When I first heard I'd be reading alongside David St. John, I was deeply honored and excited. But then I realized I would have the monumental task of introducing him. It's not the extensiveness of his career, which includes 12 collections of poetry, a volume of essays, and libretti for the opera, that makes introducing St. John no easy task. Rather, it's the challenge of conveying in a short space how rich his work is. His poetry has ranged widely in focus over his career, but whether it is Meditations on a Rocky California Shoreline, Burdened by Memory, Rome at Night, or intimate moments of love and illness, his poems are both haunting and haunted by a sincere and empathic voice that at times startles, at other times soothes. One thing that stands out immediately in St. John's work is the complexity of feeling he evokes as he explores the intricacies of relationships, taking the quietest moments between two people, as well as the most familiar of objects, and giving them a new and strange significance. In his poem Dolls, he reflects on another's long illness and connection to dolls. He begins his poem focusing on his companion, whose eyes are white with fever, a long sickness, and dreams of another country in which she walks in every breath away from him. However, rather than lingering on her illness, her growing distance from him, he thinks of her connection to dolls and strikes us with an image that is simultaneously tender, playful, and violent, stating, "As a girl, you boiled your dolls to keep them clean, presentable. You'd stir them in enormous pots as the arms and legs bent to those incredible postures you preferred." After which he asks, "How would you like me, leaning back, reading aloud from a delirious book, or sprawled across your bed, as if I'd been tossed off a high building into the street, a lesson from a young government to its people?" The contrast between intimacy and violence in this moment evokes an ambivalence on the part of the speaker that is immediately undercut by the intensity of his attention to his companion, describing her face as a doll's deliberate ache of white while she walks in dream along that grove of madness where her mother awaits, thus conveying no connection is simple or straightforward. Rather, it is wrapped in a rich tapestry of memories and feeling the audience is invited to work through in unison with the speaker. Yet, even as his rich imagery is often startling and filled with tension, it is presented by a speaker that is approachable, if not conversational, layering heightened thought and feeling with the everyday. In another poem, Lucifer in Starlight, spurred by a conversation of a man he liked enormously, the speaker reflects on nights in Rome, standing on the terrace of his apartment on a clear evening as the constellations pulse low in the Roman sky, shimmering in its elaborate webs of infinite, almost divine irony. The speaker moves seamlessly from simple observations at a party of two people and their conversation comparing Greece and Rome to an intense mystical encapsulation of a night in Rome as the deep sensual dark of the dreamer. However, St. John doesn't leave the poem dealing in broad statements about night or any specific city. His attention is immediately refocused on the intimate and particular, on remembering looking into the eye of a friend and seeing deep within the pupil of her left eye, almost like the mirage of a ship's distant hanging lantern rocking with the waves, a tiny dangling crucifix, silver lit by the ragged shards of starlight reflecting in her as quietly as pain. The imaginative leaps the speaker takes in the poem are grounded by the specificity with which he describes them, and by the speaker's voice, which evokes a sense of familiarity as someone recounting a story to, reinforced by qualifiers such as almost like, in addition to correcting himself, repeating variations of no, and it wasn't in his evaluation of Roman Nights. The combination of striking imagery, intense, complex feeling, and a familiar voice produces a subtlety in St. John's work that is both sincere and deeply affecting. In the title poem from his most recent collection of new and selected poems, The Last Troubadour, he remembers visiting friends, one of whom is an old musician turned metalwork artist. As St. John listens to his friend turn old car fenders into abstract guitars or mandolins, an old song of his friends comes on the old transistor radio, and in response, St. John's recalls, "I've watched him slowly lift the head of that torch until it angles against the turquoise plastic moon of the radio dial, as if he might melt it back to a few black platters, those times as lost as song." In that moment, the audience knows what his friend feels, even if it is unnameable, as that single action burns to the core of the experience more than words, and the poem leaves the audience reeling in that moment of near destruction. All in all, St. John's work will draw you in with its sincerity and imagination and make you appreciate these small moments between friends and lovers in new ways. Most of all, his work asks you to take stock of what it means to be human with all its beauty and complexity. It is no wonder his list of prizes includes the Rome Fellowship, the award in literature from the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, the O.B. Harrison Prize from the Folger Shakespeare Library, the George Drury Smith Lifetime Achievement Award from Beyond Baroque. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to read alongside and present to you David St. John.
Thank you, Dan. And Carrie, that was a wonderful introduction of Dan, I want to say. I really love that.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Dan, I love the end of the third sonnet so much. Would you read that again, the end of the third?
Sure, to find it in my stack of discarded. What's left, but frame number, this one, with frame number 6, what's left is locked in sunken breasts, the putrefied weight of shatter.
And also the end of number 3, because you didn't read then number 4.
Oh, 3, okay. We're left seared by the expression, cultivating ourselves as gardens we cannot claim.
Yeah, I love that. Cultivating ourselves as gardens we cannot claim. And the sense of the farm and the body farm, and the sense of the bodies decomposing, and all of the decomposition, which of course in the world gives rise to other life. So I thought that was an amazing line. I also thought the end of the Boer poem, I mean, first of all, the kind of nod, quoting the Stafford line, that's always that, you know, I thought hard for all of us before he pushes the corpse of the deer off the side of the road. I thought that was an amazing way to sort of create an alternative positionality for the speaker in the Boer poem. And I thought the end of the Boer poem, would you read the end of the Boer poem again? I thought that was just
Sure.
so gorgeous. I'm just going to steal all this. I want you to know. So just.
I'll be flattered. What I wanted to be haunted, palmettos shuddering behind the fading boar, turned out to be only salt air, heavy with ghosts of waves, the disassembling shore.
That's just fabulous. Yeah, well, you know, when you see it in one of my poems, I mean, I know you'll understand, but it's just so, so beautiful. And thank you for that really lovely introduction too. And it's really wonderful to be able, yeah, it's interesting because yesterday in Christina's class, I was sort of talking about something you mentioned, and that's the way in which so many of my poems are dialogic, and that they're kinds of one half of a conversation that's often with an intimate other, and that trying to create that space where the reader can share some of those issues and questions and dilemmas and tensions between two people, often in difficult circumstances. And I think the things that we begin to understand about ourselves most profoundly are often those things we understand in conversation with those in our lives for whom we carry the most love or the most desire or the most ambivalence. For example, maybe someone in our family, not only intimate partners. So that's often the territory that I like to really look at. I think what I'll do is start with a poem not about a person, but about a thing. And the poem's called Guitar. And I was talking, one of the questions in class yesterday was about refrains and about, because I often use refrains, it has to do with my connection to music. So I thought I'd read this poem that is somewhat about music and somewhat about the idea of a guitar, but in fact, it's really about language. Guitar. I have always loved the word guitar. I have no memories of my father on the patio at dusk, strumming a Spanish tune, or my mother draped in that fawn wicker chair, polishing her flute. I have no memories of your song, distant sister heart, of those steel strings sliding all night through the speaker of the car radio between Tucumcari and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Though I've never believed those stories of gypsy cascades, stolen horses, castanets and stars, of Airstream trailers and good fortune. Though I never met Charlie Christian, though I've danced the floors of cold longshoremen's halls, though I've waited with the overcoats at the rear of concerts for lute, mandolin, and 2 guitars. More than the music I love, scaling its woven stairways, more than the swirling chocolate of wood, I have always loved the word guitar. I loved that you quoted from Lucifer in Starlight. And I think, it comes from, it takes its source from the great poem by George Meredith, and it quotes a line of Meredith's poem, just a phrase about Lucifer. And the phrase is just, tired of his dark dominion. And there's, a kind of a famous figure who enters into this poem, the singer Nico, who you probably may or may not know from her work with the Velvet Underground. She was a model who Andy Warhol sort of discovered, and it sort of made Lou Reed accept her as a singer for the Velvet Underground, which was not at first a popular decision on his part, but it worked. But she was also involved with someone I know, Jackson Browne. So this is called Lucifer in Starlight. It was something I'd overheard one evening at a party. A man I liked enormously saying to a mutual friend, a woman wearing a vest embroidered with scarlet and violet tulips that belled below each breast. Well, I've always preferred Athens. Greece seems to me a country of the day. Rome, I'm afraid, strikes me as being a city of the night. Of course, I knew instantly just what he meant. Not simply because I love standing on the terrace of my apartment on a clear evening as the constellations pulse low in the Roman sky. The whole mind of night that I know so well, shimmering in its elaborate webs of infinite, almost divine irony. No. And it wasn't only that Rome was my city of the night, that it was here I'd chosen to live when I grew tired of my ancient life as the underground man. And it wasn't that Rome's darkness was of the kind that consoles so many vacancies of the soul. My Rome, with its endless history of falls. No, it was that this dark was the deep sensual dark of the dreamer. This dark was like the violet fur spread to reveal the illuminated nipples of the she-wolf, or the sequence above in sequence, the white buds lost in those fields of ever deepening gentians. The dark, like the polished back of a mirror. The pool of light scalloped and hanging above me, the inverted reflection of a last odd Narcissus. One night, my friend Nico came by close to 3 a.m. As we drank a little wine, I could see the black of her pupils blown wide, the spread ripples of the opiate night. And Nico pulled herself close to me, her mouth almost touching my mouth as she sighed, "Look." And deep within the pupil of her left eye, almost like the mirage of a ship's distant hanging lantern rocking with the waves, I could see at the most remote end of the receding circular hallway of her eye, there at its doorway, at the small aperture of the black telescope of the pupil, a tiny dangling crucifix, silver, lit by the ragged shards of starlight, reflecting in her as quietly as pain, as simply as pain. Some years later, I saw Nico on stage in New York, singing inside loosed sheets of shattered light, a fluid kaleidoscope washing over her, the way any naked emerging Venus steps up along the scalloped lip of her shell, innocent and raw as fate, slowly obscured by a fluorescence that reveals her simple, deadly love of sexual simplicity. I didn't bother to say hello. I decided to remember the way in Rome, out driving at night. She'd laugh as she let her head fall back against the cracked red leather of my old Lancia's seats, the soft black wind fanning her pale, chalky hair out along its currents. Ivory waves of starlight breaking above us in the leaves. The sad, lucent malevolence of the heavens falling. Both of us racing silently as light. Nowhere, then forever, into the mind of the Roman night. Well, I haven't read that in a long time. That was really fun. So I'm going to read a very different kind of poem. It's a much quieter poem, but it's a poem about a painting, and it's a painting by Klimt. And there's a book of mine called The Red Leaves of Night, and many of the poems are actually, they were triggered by different paintings of Klimt's. I always loved Klimt's sense of unfashionable opulence, his sort of the edge of desire in those paintings. And that period in Austria of a real radical revision of sensibility is one that I really look to with real admiration. This is actually a painting that has the title of several of Klimt's paintings, and it's just called The Park. And many of these paintings are simply, the whole canvas is simply filled with kind of minute renderings of leaves or trees. And this one is somewhat different because at the bottom edge, as the poem will describe, there are actually three figures. They're actually, I mean, they occupy maybe the bottom 10% of the canvas, which is fairly large. And I'd seen the canvas, I think it was in the Museum of Modern Art, and I was teaching at Oberlin, but they had a postcard of it in the museum store, and I bought it. And as the poem will describe, I just put it up in my office at Oberlin. And so I looked at it for years. And then it was probably 15 years later that I began to write these poems that really, they weren't entirely ekphrastic, but they used Klimt's work pretty directly. In fact, there's a notebook and an agenda, actually, not a notebook, but one of those agendas where they have the paintings week by week, they have a painting of the artist. And so each week there's a new painting. And when I began thinking about this, I went back and I looked, and I'd also, that same trip, I'd also bought this little skinny agenda of Klimt's paintings. And I decided I would use that, and it would be a formal constraint. And the 7 days of the week, the agenda opened to be, 1 week at a time with one painting, that would be my formal constraint. And the poem had to move in a somewhat breathless way, but it had to end by the time I ran out of room at the bottom of the right-hand page. And then when I began to rewrite these poems and to type them, then put them on a computer, I began to develop a kind of formal strategy of 4 stanzas, 4 quatrains with a single last line that worked to accommodate those, but not all of them. And this poem, The Park, is not in that kind of stanza form, but I realized how song-like that, I was talking a lot about song in class yesterday, and I realized how having those 4 stanzas of 4 lines, the quatrains, really articulated for me the use of what we call the ballad stanza or the hymnal stanza. And as a formal presence in our lives, it's everywhere. At some point, we probably all sang hymns. And the ballad stanza is, of course, a quatrain, 4 lines that rhymes A, B, A, B. And it's either in terms of beats, 4, 4, 4, 4, or 4, 3, 4, 3. And of course, one of the best known is Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that blank a wretch like me, that found a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Well, those iambic tetrameter, trimeter lines are also the base of the ballads. You open the Norton Anthology and all those anonymous ballads are working with that same song form. Poetry in English comes out of song, just as American music comes out of those ballads as they come to Appalachia. So it's something that for me was always really, really interesting. And to discover that I'd sort of moved back into that idea of song was really, it gave me a sense of movement. This poem, The Park, is really about what happens in terms of these three individuals depicted at the bottom of the painting. It was, I think, a small town in Ohio. I taped to the wall above my office desk the postcard of clips painting called The Park. An example of cliche so profuse it touched my heart, consoling me each time I turned my glance to its storm of tiny moth-sized leaves shimmering over all but the bottom ribbon of the canvas, where the rows of trunks individuate the mass of the pulsing foliage above. A figure in a kimono or a robe, so lush it too seems foliate, stands apart from two other figures similarly dressed, but the two huddled closely together and moving off the sheer right edge of the canvas. And the solitary figure remains oddly hesitant and indistinct and pensive, though perhaps she is simply realizing that she does not wish to go where all of the others wish to go. And when Carrie was talking about loss and the sense of how loss is in terms of Dan's poetry, I think that loss is really at the heart. I mean, not only as Bob Hass says, all the new thinking is about loss and all the old thinking is about loss, it's all about loss. And in terms of what we can reclaim in memory, and we say, you know, recuperate, to bring back from time that's been lost. I mean, poetry does this better than almost anything, to recuperate memory and those times and pieces of lives that otherwise might be lost. But it's also true, I think, in the way that elegy can bring back people. And this is a poem for my friend Larry Levis, great poet who died now almost 25 years ago at the age of 49. And it mentions one of his most amazing books called Winter Stars. There's also a terrific documentary about Larry that you can find online, I think even on Amazon Prime, called My Story in a Late Style of Fire, which is the title of one of his poems. and it's just subtitled Larry Levis, American Poet, so you can't miss it. And I met Larry when I was 18, and I was a freshman. He was a senior at Fresno State, where Phil Levine was. And Larry introduced me to Phil Levine, and that pretty much altered the course of my life. Later, Larry and I ended up in Iowa together at the same time. And then he became my closest friend in or out of poetry until the time he died. And when the word triumph appears here, it's a motorcycle, not anything grand, just a motorcycle. It's called "The One Who Should Write My Elegy Is Dead." The one who should write my elegy is dead. When we made that bet, he said most likely I'd be the loser, writing his elegy instead. Nothing is as beautiful as nothing, he once said. So hip, just chain-smoking camels, riding his shaky triumph up Van Ness. And the one who should write my elegy is dead. I guess I always knew I'd have to write my own elegy for him instead. Rambo on a tractor, Anna says, or Jagger pirouetting through the ranch's drying shed. The one who should write my elegy is dead, so I won't rehearse again those hungers that we fed, or expose both the cruelties and those we shared. I'll simply try again to finish writing this last elegy instead of looking back. And tonight, my daughter Vivian's off with friends, and Anna's reading of all things, winter stars in bed. And the one who should write my elegy is dead. And I'm the one, the loser, left here just as he said I'd be left here, writing his elegy instead. Let me read a poem about loss that's about losing someone before you actually lose them. Probably many of you have had the experience of having someone close to you, a grandparent, a parent, begin to move into dementia and Alzheimer's. And this is a poem for and about my mother during this time. And it's called From a Bridge. I saw my mother standing there below me on the narrow bank, just looking out over the river, looking at something just beyond the taut middle rope of the braided swirling currents. Then she looked up quite suddenly to the far bank, where the densely twined limbs of the cypress twisted violently toward the storm-struck sky. there are some things we know before we know. Also, some things we wish we would not ever know, even if as children we already knew. And so, standing above her on that bridge that shuddered each time the river ripped at its wooden pilings, I knew I could never, even fate willing, ever get to her in time. And I'm going to read just two more poems. One's short and one's longer. This first is about the great Silver Age Russian poet Alexander Blok, a poet who I just revere. I sort of, think of myself as, I don't know, a late 19th century symbolist poet who just got sent to the wrong time and place and just, so I just try to deal with that. And Blok's poems are sort of famously untranslatable. And this poem is about a dinner that I had with a couple who taught at Moscow University, but they were visiting at an American university. And it just happened that before a reading I was going to give, they were invited to the dinner. And he's someone who was and is regarded as maybe the greatest authority in the world on Pasternak and Pasternak's poetry. And she was the leading authority on Blok. And so, I just kind of rudely, just sort of focused on talking to them for the whole dinner. And it was just extraordinary. And it's, she's now died. He's still alive. His poem's just called Alexander Blok. One snowy night, I was smiled upon by Russian gods and found myself at dinner opposite the Moscow scholars, a married couple, he only the world's authority on Pasternak, and she the final word on her beloved Alexander Blok. And as we talked, the evening gathered along the length of the white table, and I could only keep drinking the conversation in so deeply. I felt myself reaching back into the dark century. And at last, I got up to leave in my black cashmere overcoat I'd found hanging on the back rack of a Venice thrift shop, and became just another shadow about to slide wordlessly into the night. And yes, it's true, it was snowing just in upstate New York, not Moscow or St. Petersburg, nor in any ancient page. Yet to anyone who saw me walking, I imagined myself as the most lyrical shadow alive. So we've been ghosts have been coming up today. And let me end with a poem. We're also in class yesterday, Christian asked about poetry, religion, Buddhism, in part, I think, because of this last poem I'm going to read called Hungry Ghost, which is a Buddhist concept and pretty much is what it sounds like. But it's also, again, a poem about a relationship. Hungry Ghost. When I came to see you, it hurt me how thin you had become in the months of addiction and disease. And although your particular abyss was a man and not a drug, the degradation was the same wasting of the flesh, the same tapped out well emptied of the least leaf of emotion, the same frozen rage. When I came to your hotel room, you were sitting in a hard chair just by the window, half slumped and distracted, looking out at the persistent rain, then silently back at me. Your ghost, your own ghost, had already come. She sat by you at the small table, and she was so hungry. At one point, she reached over, reached right inside you and slowly twisted off a moist wafer of your heart. She put it in her mouth and let it sit a moment on her tongue, her lips parting in a way both petulant and suggestive. It was clear she would eat all of you. I walked into the bathroom, and at the dulled zinc sink, I rinsed one by one the fat spring strawberries I'd brought you from the ranch. I put them in the white ceramic bowl I'd carried from our kitchen, and without a word, simply placed it on the table just beside your ghost. She stared at me, and then only at the fleshy rubies awaiting her, and ate until only a few rivulets of blood traced the bottom of the bowl, and the green crowns she'd torn from their bodies lay scattered where they'd fallen at her feet. At last, she seemed sated, placated, or even bored. She barely looked over as I wrapped you in your overcoat. You glanced at her and she at you, the rain still steady at the pane. And then I realized you could not stand alone. And so I lifted you up to take you home. Thank you.